There is a bell sitting in Philadelphia right now, behind glass, in a low-lit room, and it has a crack running through it that nobody has ever fully explained. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. That crack is the most famous flaw in American history. School children learn about it. Tour guides point to it. Photographs of it hang in government buildings from Maine to California. But here is the thing about famous things. The more people look at them, the less they actually see. Most people think they know this bell. They think they know how it broke. They think it was an accident, a metal gone brittle, a clapper swung too hard, a cold winter morning in 1846. That is the story they teach. That is the story that fits neatly into a paragraph in a textbook. But there is another story, older, quieter, passed down not in books, but in whispers, in letters tucked inside family Bibles, in the private records of men who met by candlelight in the back rooms of Philadelphia taverns. That story says the crack was no accident at all. That story says it was a signal. Close your eyes for a moment, or don't. Just let the words carry you back. It is 1751. Philadelphia is the largest city in the American colonies. The streets are packed dirt and cobblestone, slick with morning rain. The air smells like horses and wood smoke, and the salt flat bite of the Delaware River just a few blocks east. The city is loud with hammers and wagon wheels, and the shouts of merchants selling cloth and rum and dried fish from open stalls. And somewhere in that city, a group of men is waiting for a bell. Not just any bell, a specific bell, one they ordered from a foundry in London, one they paid for with public money, yes, but one they also had very specific ideas about. Ideas about its size, its weight, its inscription, the exact words they wanted cast into the metal before it ever crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Those men were members of the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly. That is the official story. Elected officials, public servants, men of reason and law. But several of them were also something else, something they did not advertise in the newspapers, something they kept quiet the way you keep a candle flame quiet. palmed in your hands, protected, hidden from view. Some of those men were Freemasons. Now, before you decide what that means, set aside everything you think you know about secret societies. Set aside the movies and the conspiracy theories and the late-night radio programs. What the Freemasons actually were in 1751 in Philadelphia was something both simpler and stranger than any of that. They were builders, thinkers, men who believed that the physical world could carry meaning, that a stone placed just right could hold a prayer, that a number carved into metal could carry a message across centuries. They believed objects could speak, and they ordered a bell. The bell arrived from London and cracked almost immediately on its very first test ring, before it had ever hung in a tower, before it had ever called a single soul to assembly. The metal split. The Foundry men in Philadelphia looked at the crack and shook their heads. They melted it down and recast it twice. And when the bell finally hung and finally rang, it rang with metal that had been broken and remade and broken again. There is something worth sitting within that image. A bell that was cracked before it was ever used. A bell that had to be destroyed and rebuilt before it could speak. A bell that, from its very first breath of existence, knew something about fracture. The men who ordered it recorded the first crack in their official minutes. They called it a disappointment. They moved on quickly. Too quickly, some historians have noted, as if the crack was not a surprise at all, as if it was, perhaps, expected. That is where this story begins. Not in 1776, when the bell supposedly rang to celebrate independence. Not in 1846, when the famous crack appeared and the bell went silent forever. But in 1751, on a cold Philadelphia morning, when a brand new bell split open on its very first ring, and a group of quiet, careful men wrote it down and said almost nothing about it. Almost nothing. Philadelphia in 1751 was not the city you might picture. There was no grand skyline, no wide paved streets lined with monuments, no sense yet that this particular patch of earth along the Delaware River would one day mean something to the whole world. It was a working town, a port town, a place place that smelled of river mud and horse sweat and wood smoke and salt pork frying in iron pans. The streets were cobblestone where they were anything at all, and dirt where they were not. In the rain, those dirt streets turned to thick brown soup that sucked at your boots and stained the hem of every coat. The buildings were mostly brick, red brick, the color of dried clay, stacked tight and close together along narrow lanes. Candlelight flickered behind small glass windows in the evenings. Lanterns hung on iron hooks at the corners of important streets. After dark, the city went quiet fast, the kind of quiet that people who live in cities today have never really heard. No electric hum, no distant traffic, just wind off the river and the occasional bark of a dog and the creak of a wooden sign swinging above a tavern door. The men who walked those streets wore long coats and buckled shoes. They wore wigs, the white powdered kind, on formal occasions. They carried candles in glass boxes when they went out at night. They wrote everything by hand, with quill pens dipped in small glass bottles of ink. They sealed their letters with wax and a stamp. They read by firelight and argued by firelight, and made every important decision of their lives by firelight. This was the world the bell was born into. Now, who actually paid for it? The Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly ordered the bell. That sounds simple, but the Assembly was not just a group of elected officials doing public business. It was a small, tight circle of men who knew each other very well. They had dinner together. They drank together. They belonged to the same clubs, the same lodges, the same informal networks that ran quietly beneath the surface of colonial life. Philadelphia in 1751 had a population of around 15,000 people. The men who made decisions for that city numbered far fewer, maybe a few hundred, if you were being generous. And the ones who really mattered, the ones whose names appeared on documents and orders and official minutes, numbered closer to a few dozen. The Assembly voted to spend 100 pounds sterling on a new bell. 100 pounds was real money in 1751. It was the kind of sum that required a formal vote, a formal record, a formal justification. The justification they gave was practical. The old state house needed a bell to mark the hours and call the assembly to session. Simple enough, civic, reasonable, the kind of thing governments buy without anyone raising an eyebrow. The order went to a foundry in London, White-Capel specifically. The White-Capel Bell Foundry was already old by then. It had been casting bells for over a century. It was the kind of place that had stone floors worn smooth by generations of workers, and walls that had absorbed so much heat from the furnaces that they stayed warm even in winter. The men who worked there were craftsmen in the old sense of the word. They knew their trade the way a farmer knows soil, by feel, by smell, by a kind of knowledge that lives in the hands. The Assembly's agent in London placed the order. His name was Robert Charles. He passed the request along. The specifications were noted. The contract was signed, and the foundry went to work. Across the Atlantic, the men in Philadelphia waited. Ships in those days took weeks to cross, sometimes months. You ordered something from London, and then you waited, and you hoped the ship did not sink, and you tried not to think too hard about all the ways things could go wrong on open water. The bell arrived in Philadelphia in August of 1752. It came off the ship and was moved carefully through those narrow brick streets to the State House yard. People stopped to look at it. A new bell was a notable thing. It was large and dark, and it smelled of metal and sea air. It had words cast into its surface, words from the Bible, chosen deliberately, chosen carefully, by men who chose everything carefully. And then they rang it, and it cracked, and those careful men wrote it down in their careful minutes and said almost nothing. The question worth asking, the one that has been sitting quietly in the background of this whole story, is a simple one. Who were those men, really? And what did they know? Their names appear in the official records like entries in a ledger. Dry, formal, stripped of everything human. But behind those names were real men with real hands and real habits. Men who ate breakfast and argued about money and walked home through the same muddy streets every evening. Men who had opinions about bells. The Pennsylvania Assembly commissioned the bell. That much is certain. But the Assembly was not some faceless institution. It was a room full of specific people, and a few of those people mattered more than the rest. Isaac Norris was one of them. He was the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly at the time, and he was the man who wrote the letter to Robert Charles in London requesting the bell. Norris was a Quaker. He was also wealthy, careful, and deeply read. He had a library at his home in Germantown that most men in the colonies could only dream about. He moved through the world slowly and with intention. He did not say things he did not mean. He did not spend money he had not thought about spending. When Isaac Norris chose a Bible verse to cast into a bell, he chose it the way a jeweler sets a stone, with patience, with purpose. He was a compact man by the accounts that survive. He wore plain clothes in the Quaker fashion, dark wool, and simple cuts, nothing that caught the light. He kept his hair neat. He had a reputation for arriving early to meetings and staying late. People trusted him the way you trust a clock that has never been wrong. He was steady. He was precise. And he was connected through business and friendship and faith to nearly every important man in Philadelphia. Then there was Thomas Leach and Charles Norris, Isaac's brother, and a handful of other assembly members whose names appear in the minutes of those early meetings. They were merchants and lawyers and landowners. They had ships and warehouses and debts and investments spread across the Atlantic world. They knew London. They knew the men who ran things. They were not provincial. They were not naive. They understood exactly what kind of world they were operating in. These men met regularly in the Pennsylvania State House, a building that was still fairly new at the time. The red brick was clean then. The white woodwork was fresh. The rooms smelled of candle wax and paper, and the particular dry warmth of a fire kept burning through a long meeting. They sat at long tables, and they talked about roads and taxes and trade, and the 1,000 small problems of running a colony. And sometimes, in between those ordinary things, they talked about symbols, because these men understood symbols. They lived in a world where symbols mattered enormously. The seal on a letter, the design on a coin, the verse carved above a doorway. Every one of those things carried meaning, and the men who chose them knew it. A bell was not just a bell. A bell was a voice. It was the sound of a community calling itself together. It was the first thing people heard when something important happened. It rang for weddings. It rang for funerals. It rang when the town needed to gather and decide something. The men who ordered this bell understood all of that. Isaac Norris, in particular, seems to have thought carefully about the inscription. The verse he chose comes from the book of Leviticus. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. That is a striking thing to put on a bell. In 1751, the American Revolution was still more than 20 years away. The colonies were still British. And yet here was this Quaker merchant, this careful, precise man, choosing a verse about proclaiming liberty to all inhabitants. Not some inhabitants, all of them. You have to sit with that for a moment. He chose that word deliberately. He was a man who chose everything deliberately. What did he mean by it? What did he imagine when he pictured that bell ringing out across Philadelphia? What did he think would happen in the years after he was gone? He died in 1766. He did not live to see the Revolution. He did not hear the bell ring on the day the Declaration was read aloud in the State House yard, but he chose the words that would ring out on that day. He set that in motion before any of it existed. That is the thing about careful men. They plan further ahead than most people think. They plant seeds in ground they will never stand on again. And sometimes, if you look closely at what they built, you can still feel the shape of what they intended. Philadelphia in 1751 was a city that smelled like bread and river mud and horse. It was the largest city in the American colonies. Maybe 40,000 people lived there, pressed together along the western bank of the Delaware River. The streets were narrow. The buildings were close. And everything moved at the pace of a walking horse or a man with somewhere to be. The city had been laid out by William Penn himself back in 1682. He wanted a grid, clean lines, order, streets running east to west, streets running north to south, everything measured and sensible. Penn was a Quaker, like so many of the men who shaped this city. Quakers believed in plainness, in quiet, in doing things right the first time and not not making a fuss about it. You can still feel that in the old maps. The streets have names like Chestnut and Walnut and Mulberry. Simple names, honest names. Names that came from the trees that used to grow there before the city swallowed them up. Walk down those streets in 1751, and here is what you would see. Brick buildings, mostly 2 and 3 stories tall, their facades the color of dried clay, their windows small and deep set against the cold. Wooden signs hanging above doorways, painted with simple pictures because not everyone could read. A boot for the cobbler, a mortar and pestle for the apothecary, a sheaf of wheat for the baker. The air in the mornings was thick with wood smoke. Every hearth in every house burning through the night to keep out the chill. By midday, the smoke would thin, and you could smell the river again. That green, damp smell that came off the Delaware like a living thing. Fishermen worked the docks before sunrise. Merchants came after, ships from London and Bristol, and the Caribbean sat heavy in the water, their hulls dark with tar, their rigging strung against the pale sky like the threads of some enormous web. The market on High Street ran twice a week. Farmers came in from the countryside with wagons full of turnips and dried corn and smoked pork. Women in linen caps moved between the stalls with baskets on their arms. Children ran underfoot. Dogs followed the smell of meat. The whole thing was loud and muddy and alive in the way that markets always are, full of small negotiations and brief arguments, and the steady human hum of people getting on with things. The State House sat at the edge of all this. It was still being finished in 1751. The tower was not yet complete. The bell they had ordered from London had not yet arrived. The building looked a little raw, a little unfinished, the way new things always do before time settles into them. Inside the State House, men in long coats sat around long tables and argued about taxes and land grants and the price of tobacco. They argued in English because they were English, technically. British subjects, every one of them. They paid taxes to a king they had never met, who lived in a palace they had never seen, across an ocean that took 2 months to cross by ship. Most of them did not think much about that arrangement. It was simply how things were. The way the river ran south. The way winter came in November. The way you paid your debts and went to church and kept your head down and got on with the business of living. But some of them thought about it constantly. Some of them sat in those long rooms and looked out the windows at the city they had built. This city of brick and mud and wood smoke. And they felt something stirring. Not yet a plan. Not yet a movement. Just a feeling, quiet and persistent, like a fire that has not yet found its fuel. The evenings in Philadelphia were gentle. Candles in windows. The sound of a fiddle from somewhere down the street. The smell of supper cooking, salt pork and boiled greens, drifting out through the gaps in wooden shutters. Families gathered close to the hearth because the dark came early and the dark was cold, and there was comfort in the small circle of firelight. Children fell asleep to the sound of their parents talking in low voices about the harvest, about the neighbors, about the letter that came from a cousin in Virginia. Small things, ordinary things. Nobody talked about revolution. Nobody talked about liberty in any grand way. Not yet. That was still a seed in the ground, still a word on a bell that had not yet crossed the ocean. The city breathed in and out. The river moved. The days passed one by one, quiet and unremarkable. The way days always pass just before everything changes. The bell arrived in the late summer of 1752. It came across the Atlantic on a ship called the Miatilla, packed in straw and rope and salt air. When they unloaded it at the Philadelphia docks, a small crowd gathered. They always gathered when something large came off a ship. It was entertainment. It was news. A bell that size was worth looking at. They hauled it through the city streets on a heavy wooden cart. The wheels left deep grooves in the soft earth. Horses strained at the harness. Men walked alongside, steadying the ropes, keeping the great bronze shape from swaying too far in either direction. Children ran ahead to watch it pass. The bell was dark and smooth, the color of an old penny, and it caught the late summer light in a way that made it seem almost warm to the touch. They hung it in the State House steeple. That took several days and a great deal of effort. when it was finally in place, high above the city, the men who had done the work stood below and looked up at it. Someone gave the signal. The bell swung. The clapper struck, and something was wrong. The sound that came out was not the sound a bell should make. It was flat, dull, a sound like a stone dropped into shallow water instead of deep. People in the street stopped walking. They tilted their heads. A few of them looked at each other without saying anything. The bell rang again, and the sound was the same. Wrong. Off, like a word spoken in the wrong language. The men in charge sent word back to London. The bell was defective, they said. The metal had cracked on its very first ring. Not a long crack, not a dramatic one, just a thin, dark line running through the bronze, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But it was there, a flaw in the casting, a mistake made somewhere across the ocean in a foundry full of noise and fire and men who worked too fast. That is the official story. That is what the records say. But here is the part the records say quickly, the part they move past without slowing down. The crack appeared on the very first ring, before the bell had been used for anything, before it had called anyone to a meeting, or marked any hour, or done any of the work a bell is supposed to do. It cracked the moment the clapper touched it for the first time, in front of a crowd, in broad daylight, and nobody could explain exactly why. Metal does not usually crack like that. Not good metal. Not metal made by craftsmen who had been casting bells for generations. The White-Capel Foundry in London had been making bells since the 1500s. They knew what they were doing. They had made bells that hung in cathedrals and courthouses and churches across England, and they had not cracked. Not on the first ring. Not like this. Two local men, John Pass and John Stowe, were given the job of fixing it. They melted the bell down and recast it right there in Philadelphia. They added copper to the mix to make the metal stronger. They poured it again and let it cool and hung it back in the steeple. And when they rang that second bell, the crowd laughed. The sound was worse, thin and bright and almost comical, like a pot being struck with a wooden spoon. So Pass and Stowe melted it down again. They adjusted the mixture. They tried a third time. And the third bell, the one that finally stayed, one that hung in that steeple for years and years. That was the bell that eventually cracked again, in a different place, in a different time, under circumstances that nobody has ever fully agreed on. But before all of that, before the second crack and the famous story and the symbol it became, there was just that first moment, that first wrong sound floating out over the rooftops of Philadelphia. That flat, broken note drifting down through the warm summer air and settling over the crowd like something they could not name. A woman standing near the cart that day is said to have put her hand to her chest when she heard it. Not in fear, not in surprise, just in the way you do when something touches a place inside you that you did not know was there. She did not say anything. She just stood there with her hand over her heart, looking up at the steeple, listening to the silence after the sound had gone. That woman was not alone in her feeling. Others in the crowd that day said the same kind of thing later. Not right away, not out loud, standing in the street, but later in quieter places, at kitchen tables, in back rooms, in the kind of low-lit spaces where people say what they actually think instead of what they are supposed to think. Philadelphia in those years was a city full of back rooms. It was a city of societies and clubs and brotherhoods. Men who met on certain nights in certain places and talked about certain things that were not meant for the open air. Some of them were merchants. Some were lawyers. Some were printers, craftsmen, men who worked with their hands all day, and then washed up and walked to a particular door and knocked in a particular way and went down a particular set of stairs into a room where candles burned low and the conversation ran deep. These were not secret in the way we think of secrets now. They were not hiding. They were just careful. There is a difference. The city had layers. That is the only way to put it. What you saw on the street was one thing. What happened below the street, in the basements and the back cellars, and the rooms behind the rooms, that was something else entirely. And when that bell cracked, those rooms started talking. The story gets passed down in pieces. No single account tells the whole thing. But if you gather the pieces together, if you hold them up to the light the way you hold a piece of old glass, a shape starts to emerge. There was a group. People called them different things in different tellings. Some said they were Freemasons. Some said they were something older than that, something that did not have a common name, but that everyone who knew about them understood. They met in a basement on a street that no longer exists, a street that was swallowed up when the city grew and changed and paved over its own history the way cities do. They met by candlelight. The walls were stone. The floor was packed earth. Someone always brought a bottle of something dark and warm, and it got passed around the table without ceremony, without comment, the way things do when a group of people has been meeting long enough that the rituals have become invisible. And on the night after the bell cracked, they talked about it. The old-timers in the neighborhood remembered this later, remembered hearing about it from fathers and uncles and men who had been young then and were old now, sitting by fires, telling it the way you tell something that you are not sure anyone will believe, but that you know to be true. One of those old-timers, a cooper who worked near the waterfront, said his grandfather had been in that room, had sat at that table, had heard the conversation with his own ears. What he said, according to the story, was this: the men in that room were not surprised by the crack. That was the thing. That was what his grandfather could never get past. They were not surprised. They were watchful. They were quiet in the way people are quiet when something happens that they have been waiting for. One of them, the oldest one, a man with white hair and ink-stained fingers, set down the bottle and said something that the grandfather remembered for the rest of his life. He said the bell had spoken. He said that was what a crack was, not a failure, not a flaw, a voice, metal finding its frequency, metal saying what it had been made to say. Nobody argued with him. The candles burned. The room smelled of tallow and damp stone, and the particular cold that comes up through earth floors, no matter what season it is above ground. And the men sat there in that smell, in that cold, in that low amber light, and they thought about what it meant that a bell commissioned by their city, hung in their steeple, had opened its mouth and spoken on the very first day it was rung. The cooper's grandfather never joined their group. He was not invited. He had only been there that night because he had come to deliver something, a message or a package. The The story does not say which, but he stood in the doorway long enough to hear what the old man said, long enough to carry it home with him, long enough that it passed from him to his son, to his son's son, and eventually to a man sitting by a waterfront fire, telling it to anyone who would listen. The bell had spoken, and some people already knew what it was trying to say. To understand what the Freemasons wanted with a bell, you have to go back further than 1752. You have to go back further than Philadelphia. You have to go back to the idea itself, the idea that a sound could carry meaning. That metal, shaped by human hands and struck by human force, could speak something true into the open air. That idea is old, older than any country. The Freemasons knew this. They had studied it. The lodges that met in Philadelphia in the mid-1700s were not simple social clubs. These men read. They traveled. They corresponded with brothers in London, in Edinburgh, in Paris. They knew the old traditions. They knew that bells had been used for centuries to mark sacred moments, to open ceremonies, to call the invisible world to attention. Church bells, temple bells, the bells hung in towers across Europe that rang not just to tell the hour, but to say something about the nature of time itself. In the old Masonic tradition, sound was not decoration. Sound was structure. Sound was a way of organizing the world. The bell they had helped commission for the Pennsylvania State House was, in their understanding, more than a civic object. It was an instrument, and instruments, they believed, had to be tuned, had to be prepared, had to be consecrated, in a sense, before they could do their proper work. Now here is where the story gets layered. Because the Freemasons in Philadelphia in 1752 were not operating in a vacuum. They were operating in a city that sat on land with its own long memory. The Lenape people had lived along the Delaware River for generations beyond counting. They had their own relationship with sound, with ceremony, with the idea that certain places were thin places, spots where the seen and unseen worlds pressed close together. The hill where the State House was built, some old accounts suggest, was one of those places. A place where the Lenape had gathered. A place that already carried weight. The early Quaker settlers who came with William Penn knew some of this. They were quieter about it than most, but they knew. And when the Freemasons among the later settlers began to plan their city, their symbols, their buildings, they were not starting from nothing. They were layering their own meanings onto a place that already had meanings. The way a river carves deeper into a canyon that was already there. The bell was meant to be part of that layering. What the Freemasons wanted, specifically, was a tone, a frequency. The old brothers talked about this in terms that sound strange to modern ears. They believed that certain tones, when struck in certain places, could open something. Not a door, not a physical thing, more like a channel, a line of connection between the work being done in the physical world and the larger pattern they believed that work was part of. They had studied the old writings, the Pythagorean ideas about music and mathematics, the Hermetic texts that described the universe as a kind of vibration, the Kabbalistic traditions that assigned meaning to sound and letter and number. These were not fringe ideas to educated men of the 1700s. These were serious subjects. These were things worth knowing. And so, when the bell arrived from London and cracked on the very first ring, the men in that basement did not see failure. They saw something else entirely. They saw a bell that had refused to accept the frequency it was given. A bell that had broken its own voice rather than speak in the wrong key. That meant something to them. It meant the bell was not finished. It meant the bell was waiting. The two Philadelphia founders who recast the metal, pass and stow, were local men, working men. But some of the brothers believed they had been guided, that the recast bell, made from the same metal, but shaped by different hands in different conditions, had been brought closer to the right tone. Not perfect, but closer. And when that second bell cracked too, the conversation in the basement grew very quiet, because now the bell had refused twice. And in the old traditions, when something refuses twice, you do not force it a third time. You listen. You ask what it is trying to tell you. You consider the possibility that the object itself knows something you do not. The bell that eventually hung in the steeple was the third version, the third casting, and the men who watched it go up into that tower watched it the way you watch something that has already surprised you twice. With respect, with a little wonder, and with the particular patience of people who believe that the right moment, when it finally comes, will be unmistakable. A man named Caleb Whitmore came to Philadelphia in the spring of 1753. That is not a famous name. You will not find it in most history books, but in certain old letters passed between collectors and kept in private hands, his name comes up again and again. He was a printer by trade, a careful man, the kind of man who notices things that other people walk past without a second glance. Whitmore had heard the stories, not the official ones, the other ones, the kind that travel by word of mouth from one quiet room to another, never quite loud enough to be called a rumor. He had heard that the bell hanging in the Pennsylvania State House steeple was not simply a bell, that it had been made with intention, that the men who commissioned it had left marks in the metal that most people would never think to read. So he went to look. He stood beneath the steeple on a gray morning, the sky the color of old pewter, the air carrying the smell of the river and wood smoke and horse. He looked up at the bell, the way you look at something when you are trying to understand it rather than simply see it. And then he started writing things down. The inscription on the bell was well known. It came from the book of Leviticus. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Those words had been chosen by the Pennsylvania Assembly. That much was public record. But Whitmore was not interested in the words everyone already knew. He was interested in what surrounded them. The bell's crown, where the metal loops up to meet the iron yoke, was cast with a particular pattern. A series of interlocking curves. Whitmore sketched them carefully in a small leather notebook, pressing hard with his pen so the lines would be clear. He had seen patterns like that before, not on bells, on the floors of certain meeting rooms, on the covers of certain books that were not available at the public lending library. He noted the placement of the Foundry mark, Whitfield and Son, London. The letters were arranged in a specific arc. Whitmore measured the arc with a piece of string and wrote down the angle. He did not explain in his notes why he measured it. He simply wrote the number and underlined it twice. The bell female's waist, the widest part of the body, carried a decorative border. Most people assumed it was purely ornamental. Whitmore did not assume that. He counted the repeated elements in the border. He counted them 3 times to be sure. The number he arrived at was not random. It matched a number that appeared in several Masonic texts of the period, a number associated with the 3rd degree of initiation, with completion, with the moment a thing becomes what it was always meant to be. He wrote in his notebook, "The border is a calendar, not of days, of steps." Now, Whitmore was not a Freemason himself, or if he was, he never said so directly. But he had spent years around men who were, and he had learned to read the visual language they used. It was a language built into objects, into architecture, into the proportions of a doorway or the arrangement of windows on a building's face. Once you learned to see it, you saw it everywhere. And once you saw it everywhere, you could not stop. He spent 3 days in Philadelphia. He visited the State House twice more. He talked to a man who had worked in the Foundry, where Pass and Stowe had done the recasting. An old fellow who smelled of iron filings and linseed oil, and who had very little to say, but whose eyes moved in a particular way when Whitmore asked about the crown pattern, like a man who had been told not to speak about something and was relieved that someone had finally asked. The old Foundry man did not give Whitmore answers, but he gave him a direction. He told him to look at the bell, not as a single object, but as a conversation. A conversation between the men who ordered it, the men who made it, and the men who were meant to receive the message inside it. Whitmore wrote that down too. A conversation. He underlined it. He left Philadelphia on a Thursday. His notebook went with him. And somewhere between that spring morning and the present day, the notebook disappeared. The way certain things disappear when they have gotten too close to something that was never meant to be found. But the bell is still there, and the patterns are still in the metal, waiting for the next person who knows how to look. The bell rang on a cold morning in February of 1753. That much is agreed upon. The air was sharp and pale, the kind of cold that sits in your chest like a stone. The streets of Philadelphia were quiet. Most people were still inside, close to their fires, their breath making small clouds in the dark rooms of their houses. But a few people were outside that morning, and what they heard stayed with them for the rest of their lives. A woman named Eliza Hartwell lived 2 streets over from the State House. She was 31 years old, a seamstress, practical and plain-spoken by all accounts. She wrote about that morning in a letter to her sister in Virginia. The letter survived. It passed through several hands before ending up in a private collection in Maryland, where a researcher named Caldwell found it in the 1940s and copied it out by hand. Eliza wrote that she heard the bell begin to ring at just past 7 in the morning. She said it started normally enough, a deep, round sound. She compared it to a stone dropped into still water. The tone spread outward and then faded and then came again. She counted the strikes. She wrote that she lost count somewhere after 12. Then she wrote something stranger. She said the tone changed, not loudly, not with a crack or a bang, the way people later described it. She said it shifted, the way a voice shifts when a person moves from one room to another. Lower, wider, like the bell had found a new way to speak. She put down her needle. She walked to the window. She looked out at the gray morning sky and the bare trees and the frozen mud of the street. She wrote that she felt for a moment that the sound was not coming from the bell at all, that it was coming from inside the ground, from somewhere deep and old and patient. Then it stopped. She went back to her work, but she wrote to her sister that she did not feel quite the same after that morning. Like something had shifted just slightly in the world, the way a door shifts when the house settles. A man named Thomas Greer was closer. He was a laborer who hauled wood and coal through the city, and he was passing the State House yard when the ringing began. He told the story to his son, who told it to his own children, and one of those children wrote it down in a family memoir sometime around 1820. Thomas said he stopped his cart. He said the horses stopped too, without him telling them to. They stood very still with their ears flat, and their breath coming in long, slow streams in the cold air. He said the horses did not spook. They did not pull away. They just went quiet, like they were listening. He looked up at the tower. He could see the bell swinging through the open louvers. He watched it move back and forth, catching the thin winter light. He said it looked like it was made of something other than metal in that moment. He said it looked almost warm, like it was lit from inside. Then he heard the sound change. He described it the same way Eliza Hartwell did, though he had never met her and could not have read her letter. He said it went lower, wider, like the bell had opened up somehow, like it had gotten bigger on the inside. His horses did not move until the ringing stopped completely. He drove on, but he told his son that he thought about that morning for years afterward. He said it was not a frightening thing. He was clear about that. He said it was more like being spoken to in a language you almost understand, like hearing your name called from a great distance and not being sure if it was meant for you. There is one more account. It comes from a young apprentice clerk who was working in a building near the State House that morning. His name is not recorded. He left only a single line in a ledger margin, written in small, careful letters beside a column of numbers. The line reads, "The bell rang, and then it rang differently, and I do not know what the second sound was for." That is all he wrote. He went back to his numbers. He did not explain further. Maybe he could not. Maybe some things sit just outside the reach of words, in that quiet space where you know something happened, but you cannot say what it was. The bell rang that morning, and some people heard it twice. Now think about that for a moment. Not the bell itself, not the crack. Think about the pattern underneath it all. Because here is the thing about patterns. They do not announce themselves. They do not come with signs or arrows pointing the way. They build slowly, the way frost builds on glass overnight. You wake up one morning and the window is covered in white crystal lines, and you realize the cold has been working all along while you slept. The Liberty Bell cracked. That is the simple fact everyone agrees on. But when you start laying the stories side by side, when you start looking at the dates and the names and the places, something else begins to take shape. Something quiet and deliberate. Something that does not feel like an accident. Consider the timing. The first crack appeared not during some grand ceremony, not during a moment of great public celebration. It appeared during a test, a private moment, a moment when only a small number of men were present and watching. That is worth sitting with. The bell was not ringing for a crowd. It was ringing for a room. Now look at other bells. Not just this one. History is full of bells that cracked at strange moments. The Tsar bell in Russia, the great bronze giant that never rang at all, cracked during a fire that broke out under circumstances nobody fully explained. The Borden bell at Notre Dame cracked twice before it was finally recast. The Stentor bell in Philadelphia, a lesser-known cousin to the Liberty Bell, developed a fracture in 1753 that the Foundry records describe only as a failure of unknown origin. These are different bells in different places, made by different hands, but the pattern rhymes. Bells were not just instruments of sound in the 18th century. They were instruments of meaning. Every town, every church, every civic building used its bell to mark time, to call people together, to signal that something had changed. A cracked bell was not just broken. A cracked bell was silent, and silence, in the right moment, is its own kind of message. The men who ordered the Liberty Bell understood this. They were not simple administrators filling out a purchase order. They were men who thought in symbols, men who believed that the physical world could carry meaning the way a letter carries words. When they chose the inscription for the bell, they did not choose something plain. They chose a line from Leviticus, from the old law, about proclaiming liberty throughout the land. That is not a random choice. That is a deliberate one. And here is where the dates begin to line up in ways that are hard to dismiss. The bell arrived in Philadelphia in August of 1752. It cracked almost immediately, before it had rung publicly even once. It was recast twice in the following months. The second recast was completed in the spring of 1753. That spring, several of the men who had commissioned the bell were also present at a series of meetings held in private rooms around the city. The records of those meetings are incomplete. Some pages are missing. Some entries are written in a shorthand that historians have never fully decoded. That could be coincidence. Records go missing all the time. Shorthand was common, But the same men appear again and again in the same rooms, around the same dates, connected to the same object. Their names overlap like rings in water after a stone has been dropped. There is a principle that investigators use in any field when they are trying to understand something complicated. It goes like this. One strange event is an anomaly. Two strange events connected by a common thread are a coincidence. Three or more strange events connected by multiple common threads are a pattern. And patterns, by definition, do not happen by themselves. Patterns require a cause. The bell cracked. The same men were present. The same symbols appeared on its surface. The same dates kept returning in the records. And across the city, in the same years, the same quiet organizations were meeting, planning, and leaving their marks on the buildings and documents of a new nation being built from the ground up. You can call all of that coincidence. Plenty of people do. Plenty of serious, careful people look at this collection of facts and say it adds up to nothing more than the ordinary chaos of history. Things overlap, dates rhyme. Men who know each other tend to show up in the same places. That is fair. That is honest. But there is another way to look at it. Sometimes a crack is just a crack. And sometimes a crack is the place where something was meant to open. The bell rang that morning, and some people heard it twice. Now we begin to ask why. There was a man named John Pass. You may not know that name. Most people don't. But if you want to understand what happened to the Liberty Bell, you need to sit with that name for a moment. John Pass. Say it slowly. Because John Pass is the man who recast the bell. He is the man who poured the metal. He is the man who stood over the mold and watched the bronze cool and harden into the shape that would become one of the most recognized objects in American history. And according to the story that has been passed down through certain circles in Philadelphia, John Pass knew something he was never supposed to say out loud. The year was 1753. The original bell had cracked on its very first ring. You heard about that already. The embarrassment was real. The Pennsylvania Assembly wanted it fixed, so they turned to two local men, John Pass and John Stowe, and they said, "Melt it down and do it again." Pass was a brass founder by trade. He worked with metal the way a baker works with bread. He understood heat and pressure, and the way a liquid thing becomes a solid thing when the world cools around it. He was good at his work. He was trusted. But here is the part that the official records skim past. Pass did not work alone. He had help, and the men who helped him were not listed in any city ledger. They came to his foundry at odd hours. They brought with them specific measurements, written on paper in a hand that Pass later described to at least one person as unlike any writing he had seen before. The letters were clean and deliberate. The numbers were precise to a degree that surprised him. He was a craftsman. He knew what careful looked like. And this, he said, was something more than careful. This was intentional in a way that felt almost ceremonial. The foundry itself sat near the edge of the city. It was a low brick building with a wide chimney that threw orange light into the night sky when the furnace was running. The smell of hot metal hung in the air for blocks around it. Neighbors knew when Pass was working by the color of the smoke. On the nights when the bell was being recast, the smoke ran darker than usual, thicker. It settled over the rooftops like a wool blanket pulled down from the sky. Pass worked through several nights to get it right. The first recast had failed. The bell rang flat and dull, and the assembly made him do it again. He added more copper. He adjusted the ratios, and on the third attempt, the bell came out singing, clear and bright, and carrying a tone that could travel for miles on a still morning. He was proud of it. He had his name put on it, right there in the cast metal. John Pass and John Stowe. You can still read those names on the bell today if you look at the lower half of the crown. They are right there, pressed into the bronze, permanent as anything in this world gets. But pride and secrets do not always sit comfortably together. In the years after the bell was hung and rung and celebrated, Pass grew quiet on the subject. People who knew him said he changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that made anyone call a doctor or whisper about his health. Just quieter, more careful with his words. He had been an open man, a social man, the kind of craftsman who liked to talk about his work over a pint of ale at the end of a long day. After the bell, that changed. one account passed down through a Philadelphia family whose name appears in several early city records, says that Pass told a close friend something in his final years. He said that the bell had been made to a design he did not fully understand, that the measurements he had been given were not just about sound or weight or durability, that there was a geometry to the bell that went beyond what any foundry man would need to know. He said he had asked about it once, early on, and the man who brought the measurements had smiled at him and said only that the bell would do what it was meant to do when the time came. Pass died in 1775, the same year the war began. His foundry records were never fully preserved. Some say they were lost. Some say they were taken. The bell he made still hangs in Philadelphia. His name is still on it, and the crack runs right through the metal he poured with his own hands on those dark, smoky nights, following measurements he never fully understood. Now think about the words on the bell itself. Most people have seen them. Most people have read them without really reading them. They are printed on postcards and coffee mugs and schoolroom posters. They have become so familiar that the eye slides right over them, the way you stop hearing a clock tick after the first hour. But sit with the words for a moment. Really sit with them. The inscription on the Liberty Bell reads, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." That line comes from the Bible. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10. It is a verse about the Jubilee year, a sacred year in ancient Hebrew tradition when debts were forgiven, slaves were freed, and land was returned to its original owners. A year of release, a year of return, a year when the old order was wiped clean and something new could begin. The men who chose that verse knew exactly what it meant. They were educated men who read Latin and Greek and Hebrew, men who studied ancient texts the way other men studied weather patterns or crop yields. They did not open the Bible, close their eyes, and point to a random verse. They chose Leviticus 25, verse 10 with care, with intention. And here is where the detail gets strange. The Jubilee year in the Hebrew tradition did not happen just any year. It happened every 50th year. 50 years of ordinary time, and then the world reset. The slate wiped clean, the horns blown, the proclamation made. The bell was ordered in 1751. It was meant to mark the 50th anniversary of William Penn's original charter for Pennsylvania. 50 years. A jubilee. The verse chosen was the Jubilee verse. That much is known. That much is documented. But count forward 50 years from 1751. You land on 1801. Now count forward 50 years from the year the Declaration of Independence was signed. From 1776, you land on 1826, the year both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died. On the same day, the 4th of July, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration itself. People called it a miracle, a coincidence too perfect to be accidental. Two founding fathers, rivals turned friends, dying on the exact 50th anniversary of the document they had both helped create. The country was stunned. The newspapers called it an act of God. But here is the thing about the inscription. Here is the detail that sits quietly at the center of all of this. The verse does not just say proclaim liberty. It says proclaim liberty and return. Return to your family. Return to your land. Return to the beginning. The Jubilee was not just a celebration. It was a reckoning. A moment when hidden things came back to the surface. When buried debts were called in. When what had been taken was supposed to be given back. Some people who have studied the bell's inscription closely point out that the verse was not quoted exactly. The full verse in Leviticus reads slightly differently. The men who wrote the inscription made small changes, subtle ones, the kind of changes a careful reader would notice and a casual reader would not. One word in particular was shifted. In the original text, the proclamation is made to the inhabitants of the land. In the bell's inscription, the word order is slightly rearranged. It is a small thing. It could be nothing. Scribes made errors. Engravers worked by hand in dim light. But the men who commissioned this bell were not careless. They were the kind of men who noticed when a single letter was out of place in a document. They were the kind of men who believed that words, arranged in the right order, carried power beyond their ordinary meaning. The Freemasons believed that deeply. They believed that certain phrases, spoken or written or cast in metal, could act as keys. That language was not just communication. It was architecture. It was a structure that, built correctly, could open something. What the inscription was really saying, according to the people who have spent years turning this over, was not just a celebration of Pennsylvania's charter. It was a marker, a signal set in bronze and hung in a tower, waiting for the right moment to ring, waiting for the jubilee to come, waiting for the time the bell would do, as the man with the measurements once told Pass what it was meant to do. The crack runs right through those words now, right through the proclamation, right through the promise. Some say the crack is the message that the bell spoke once when it was meant to speak, and then it went silent because the message had been received. Not everyone believes that, and honestly, that is fair. Some very smart people have looked at the Liberty Bell story and said, enough. Enough with the symbols. Enough with the secret meanings. A bell cracked. Bells crack. That is what bells do. The mystery, they say, is not a mystery at all. Let's sit with that for a moment. Let's give those people their due. The official story of the second crack is simple and clean. The bell had already been repaired once, back in 1753, when Pass and Stowe recast it after the first crack on arrival from London. That new bell rang for decades. It rang for the reading of the Declaration. It rang for funerals and celebrations, and the slow turning of a young country finding its footing. And then, on a cold February morning in 1846, the bell cracked again. Badly. For good. The date was February 23rd. The bell was ringing in honor of George Washington's birthday. The metal had grown old. It had been rung thousands of times over nearly a century. The cold air had made it brittle. The vibrations built up, and somewhere in the body of the bell, in a thin place in the metal, the stress became too much. The crack spread. The sound went wrong. And that was that. That is the official story. It is tidy. It is logical. It is the kind of explanation that fits in a textbook and asks nothing more of you. The skeptics will also point out that the Freemasons, while certainly present in early Philadelphia did not control the Pennsylvania Assembly. They did not commission the bell. They did not write the inscription. The verse from Leviticus was a natural choice for a bell celebrating the 50th anniversary of William Penn's charter. Jubilee imagery was common. It was not code. It was just the Bible, used the way people used the Bible back then, openly and without hidden meaning. And the symbols on the bell, the skeptics say those were standard decorative choices. Craftsmen of that era used certain patterns because they were fashionable, not because they were sacred geometry. A rope border was a rope border. A crown was a crown. Reading secret meaning into decoration, they argue, is the same as finding shapes in clouds. You will always find what you are looking for if you look hard enough. These are not weak arguments. They deserve respect. But here is where the skeptics go quiet. The crack did not appear randomly in the metal. It did not split across a blank section of the bell's body. It ran directly through the inscription, through the word liberty itself, through the proclamation that the bell's supporters had spent so much energy choosing, debating, and casting into the bronze. Of all the places on that bell where the metal could have failed, it failed there. Right through the promise. A skeptic will say that is coincidence. And maybe it is. But the crack also appeared in a very specific pattern. Bell experts who have studied it over the years have noted that the fracture does not look like a standard stress crack. Standard cracks follow the path of least resistance in the metal. They wander. They branch. This crack is unusually clean in certain sections, unusually deliberate looking, not impossible for a natural crack, but unusual enough that more than one metallurgist has paused over it and said something like, "That is interesting." And then there is the timing. The bell cracked on Washington's birthday. Washington, who was a Freemason. Washington, whose Masonic funeral rites were conducted with full ceremony when he died in 1799. Washington, whose image and memory were already being woven into the founding mythology of the country in ways that had very little to do with accident. The skeptics cannot explain the timing. They call it coincidence too. And again, maybe they are right. But coincidences have a way of stacking up around this bell. One coincidence is nothing. Two is a pattern. 3 or 4 or 5. And even the most careful, reasonable person starts to feel something shift in the back of their mind. Some small, quiet doubt. Some sense that the official story, clean as it is, might have a gap in it somewhere. The gap is not large. It does not prove anything, but it is there. And the people who believe the bell was more than a bell, more than a lump of old bronze that wore out and split under pressure, those people will point to that gap every single time. They will point to it and say, "Explain that." And the room gets a little quieter. The believers are not loud people. That is the first thing you notice about them. They do not wave their arms. They do not shout across the room. They sit with their hands folded, and they speak in the same even tone you might use to describe the weather. They have been carrying this story for a long time. They are used to the looks people give them. They stopped caring about those looks years ago. There was a man in Philadelphia in the early 1800s, a printer by trade. He kept a small shop near the waterfront where the smell of salt and fish and tar drifted in through the windows on warm days. He had a habit of writing things down, not for publication, just for himself. Small observations, things he heard, things he saw. His name does not appear in any official record connected to the bell, but his notebooks survived. They passed through 3 families before landing in a private collection sometime in the 1940s. And in those notebooks, he wrote about the men he saw coming and going from the State House yard in the days after the bell cracked in 1846. He did not say they were Masons. He did not use that word. He described them as men who moved with purpose. Men who did not look like tourists or mourners. Men who arrived in pairs, spoke quietly to each other, looked at the bell for a long time, and then left. He wrote that one of them smiled, not a sad smile, not the smile of a man looking at something broken, the smile of a man looking at something finished. That detail has stayed with people, the smile, because grief does not look like that. Curiosity does not look like that, but satisfaction does. Now, you can read that notebook entry a dozen different ways. the printer might have misread the man's expression. He was watching from a distance. The light in Philadelphia in February is thin and pale, the kind of light that flattens faces and makes it hard to read anything clearly. Maybe the man was simply relieved the bell had not fallen. Maybe he was glad no one was hurt. Maybe it meant nothing at all. But the believers do not think it meant nothing. And here is what gives their position some weight. It is not just the notebook. It is the pattern of small things that do not fit the official version, stacked one on top of the other like stones in a wall. The official story says the bell cracked because it was old and the metal was flawed, and it had been rung too many times under too much stress. That is a reasonable explanation. Metal does fail. Bells do crack. No one disputes that bells crack. But the believers point out that the men responsible for the bell in 1846 had already repaired it once before. They knew it was fragile. They had widened the crack themselves to keep the edges from grinding. They were careful people, experienced people, and yet on that particular morning, on Washington's birthday, with the city watching, they rang it anyway. Hard enough to finish it. Why that day? Why that ring? A woman in the 1920s wrote a letter to a Philadelphia historical society. She was in her 80s. Her grandfather had been a craftsman who worked near the State House in the 1840s. She said he told her more than once that the men who rang the bell that morning knew what they were doing. She said he told her the crack was not a surprise to everyone in that yard. She said he told her some of the men there did not look surprised at all. The Historical Society wrote back a polite letter. They thanked her. They filed her letter away. It sat in a box for decades before anyone looked at it again. That is what it costs to speak up. You get a polite letter. You get filed away. Your grandfather's memory becomes a footnote that no one reads. But the believers keep reading. They keep finding these small, quiet voices. The printer who noticed the smile. The old woman whose grandfather watched the yard. The Foundry records that do not quite add up. The inscription that points somewhere the official story does not go. They gather these things the way some people gather stones from rivers, one at a time, turning each one over in the light. They are not trying to prove prove anything to you. They gave up on that a long time ago. They are just holding what they found, waiting to see if you reach out your hand and ask to look. Most people don't, but some do. And once you hold one of those stones, it is hard to put it back down. There is a parade that people in Philadelphia still talk about, even now, even when they cannot quite remember why it matters. It happened in the summer of 1835. The city was loud that day. Flags hung from every window on Chestnut Street, bright red and white against the pale stone buildings. The air smelled of horse sweat and fresh bread, and the particular sweetness of a crowd pressed together in the heat. The bell was rung that day for a funeral procession. John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, had died. He was a man of great weight in this country, a man whose words had shaped the law like a river shapes stone. Philadelphia wanted to honor him, so they rang the bell. They rang it long and slow, the way you ring a bell for someone who will not come back. And somewhere in that ringing, something gave way. The crack that most people know, the wide, dark split you can see today if you stand close enough to press your finger into it. That crack came from this day. Or so the official story goes. The bell had been recast twice already. It had been tested and retested. It had rung for years without trouble. And then, on this particular morning, for this particular man, it split open like old wood in a dry summer. The ground around Independence Hall remembers that day differently than the history books do. There is a stretch of cobblestone on the south side of the building where the mortar between the stones has never held right. Workers have filled it in a dozen times over the years. It cracks again every winter along the same line, in the same direction. Old groundskeepers used to say the earth beneath that spot was restless. They did not mean it as a ghost story. They meant it plainly, the way you say a door hangs crooked because the frame shifted. The ground shifted. Something underneath it never settled. The elm trees that once stood along the east wall of the yard grew in a way that puzzled the gardeners of that era. Their roots turned away from the building rather than toward it. Trees reach for water. They reach for soft soil. These trees reached away, as if the ground near the wall held something they did not want to touch. Most of those trees are gone now, but the ones that replaced them did the same thing. Gardeners stopped planting close to that wall eventually. They did not write down why. They just stopped. The Delaware River, which runs not far from the hall, shifted its shallow banks slightly in the years following 1835. Not dramatically, not in a way that made the newspapers, but the fishermen who worked that stretch of water noticed. The sandbars moved. The current ran a little differently near the old ferry crossing. One old account, written in a letter by a man named Elias Cord, described the change as the river turning its shoulder. He meant it as a figure of speech. Maybe. Animals have always behaved strangely near the hall during certain times of year. Pigeons, which will roost on almost anything in a city, avoided the bell tower for long stretches in the mid-1800s. Dogs brought near the building during evening hours would sometimes stop and refuse to go further, sitting down on the cobblestones with their ears flat and their eyes fixed on nothing visible. People noticed. People always notice these things. They just rarely write them down in places where historians look. The parade itself wound through the city like a slow, dark river. Thousands of people lined the streets. The bell rang above them, heavy and low, each tone rolling out across the rooftops and down toward the water. People said you could feel it in your chest more than you could hear it. That is what a bell that size does. It does not just make sound, it moves through you. And when the crack appeared, the men who were nearest to the bell did not panic. That is the detail that keeps coming back. Witnesses described them as calm, measured. One account says a man in a dark coat looked at the crack, nodded once, and walked away without a word. You have to wonder what he was nodding at. The land around that building has been paved over and built up and landscaped and re-landscaped for nearly 3 centuries now. But something in it still moves. Something in it still shifts along old lines. The ground does not forget what happened above it. The trees do not forget what their roots found. The river does not forget which way it turned. The bell cracked. The city mourned. And somewhere, quietly, someone nodded. After that nod, the bell went quiet. Not silent, still hung in its tower. People still walked past it, but it stopped being rung for public occasions. It stopped being the voice of the city. For nearly 50 years, it sat up there in the dark and the dust, and most of Philadelphia went about its business as if the bell had never existed at all. That kind of silence is strange for something so large, something that had been so loud. When a thing goes quiet that fast, you start to wonder why. There is a pattern to this, and it shows up in other places, in other times, with other objects at the center of it. Think about the great church bells of New England. Some of the oldest ones, cast in the early 1700s, rang faithfully for decades. Then, one by one, they stopped. Not because they broke, not because the churches closed. The records show the bells were simply taken down, stored, moved to back rooms and cellars, and locked outbuildings. The official reasons were always thin. The rope wore out. The tower needed repair. The congregation voted to stop. But the timing in town after town lines up in ways that are hard to explain. They went quiet in the same decade, sometimes in the same year, as if someone sent a letter that nobody saved. There was a bell in Salem, Massachusetts, that rang every morning for 30 years. Then, in 1793, it stopped. The church elder who ordered it, silenced, left no explanation in the records. He left only a single line in his personal diary. It said simply that the bell had done its work. That is all. The bell had done its work. What work was that, exactly? Nobody wrote it down. Out in western Pennsylvania, there was a foundry that cast bells for small towns and frontier settlements all through the late 1700s. The man who ran it kept detailed logs. Every bell he made, every town it went to, every weight and alloy and date. But there are gaps in those logs, weeks at a time where the pages are blank. And in the margins of one blank stretch, someone wrote 4 words in a different hand. The words were, "The quiet is kept." Historians have puzzled over that line for a long time. Nobody has offered a satisfying answer. These are not connected stories, not officially, but they breathe the same air. There is something in American history about the deliberate silencing of bells, not the breaking of them, not the melting of them down, just the stopping, the careful, intentional going quiet of something that had been speaking. It happens too often to be coincidence. It happens in too many places, across too many decades, with too many thin explanations attached to it. The Liberty Bell fits this pattern exactly. It cracked in 1846, during that cold February ringing for George Washington's birthday. And after that, it was retired. Officially because of the crack. But the crack had been there before, in some form, for years. The bell had been recast. It had been drilled. It had been rung with a crack running through it for a long time before anyone decided the crack was finally too much. So why 1846? Why that particular ringing? Why that particular morning? The bell sat in Independence Hall for decades after that. Visitors could see it. A few people touched it, but it made no sound. It was present, but silent, the way a person can be present in a room and still somehow absent. Then something shifted. In the 1880s, people started paying attention to it again, not as a working bell, as a symbol, as a relic. It began to travel. It went to exhibitions in New Orleans and Chicago and Atlanta. Crowds gathered around it. Children pressed their palms against its cold green side. Old men stood in front of it with their hats in their hands. The bell had become something else entirely. It had moved from instrument to icon, from a thing that speaks to a thing that means. That transition is worth sitting with for a moment. When something stops making its original sound, it does not go silent. It starts making a different kind of sound, one you feel rather than hear. The Liberty Bell stopped ringing in 1846 and started speaking in a language that had no notes, no pitch, no vibration you could measure with any tool. Just weight, just presence, just the slow, steady pressure of a thing that knows more than it is saying. The bell went quiet, and in that quiet, it got louder. When the bell began to travel, it needed handlers, real ones, men who could lift it, brace it, load it onto rail cars, and stand beside it through long hot days in exhibition halls while strangers pressed close. These were not famous men. Their names do not appear in most history books, but some of them left things behind. and those things are strange. The first move happened in 1885. The bell was loaded onto a flat car in Philadelphia and sent south to New Orleans for the world's industrial and cot centennial exposition. A crew of city workers handled the loading. Their names were recorded in a municipal ledger that still exists, held in a small archive in Pennsylvania. 7 men signed that ledger. Their signatures are ordinary, but someone in pencil drew a small symbol next to 4 of the 7 names. It looks like a compass with 1 leg missing. Nobody has ever explained who drew it or when. You can hold a photograph of that ledger page. It is grainy and brown at the edges. The pencil marks are faint but clear. 4 names, 1 symbol, 4 times. There is a photograph from the New Orleans exhibition itself. It was taken in 1885 and shows the bell on its wooden cradle, surrounded by a crowd in formal dress. Men in dark coats, women in wide-brimmed hats. The bell sits in the center like something holy. But if you look at the far left edge of the photograph, behind a pillar, there is a man standing apart from the crowd. He is not looking at the bell. He is looking at the camera. His face is calm. His right hand is pressed flat against the pillar beside him, fingers spread wide. Researchers who have studied this photograph cannot identify him. He appears in no other image from the exhibition. He is just there, watching, with his hand on the stone. When the bell traveled to Chicago in 1893 for the world's Columbian Exposition, a different crew handled the move. One of those men was a laborer named August Frey. He kept a small notebook. It survived because his granddaughter donated it to a historical society in Ohio in 1971. Most of it is ordinary. Grocery lists, weather notes, a few lines about his children. But on the day he helped load the bell, he wrote something that does not fit the rest of the notebook at all. He wrote, "The bell is heavier than it should be. Not in weight, in the other way. The foreman told us not to touch the crack. I touched it anyway. I don't know why. My hand felt warm for the rest of the day." That is all he wrote about it. He never mentioned the bell again. The notebook is real. You can request to see it. The paper is soft and yellowed. The ink faded to a pale brown. His handwriting is careful and small, the handwriting of a man who did not write often and wanted to get it right when he did. Then there is the matter of the wooden cradle. The bell has been mounted on several cradles over the years as the old ones wore out. One of the earliest surviving cradles, built sometime in the mid-1800s, was examined by a carpenter in 1902 when it was being replaced. He noted in his work order that several of the wooden joints had been carved with small marks on their inner faces. The sides that would never be visible once the cradle was assembled. The marks were not decorative. They were precise, repeated. The carpenter described them as looking like letters, but not from any alphabet he recognized. That work order is in the Philadelphia City Archives. The cradle itself was broken apart and discarded. Nobody thought to save it. This is how physical evidence works in a story like this. It does not arrive in a clean line. It comes in pieces. A ledger mark, a photograph with a stranger in it, a laborer's private note about warmth in his hand, a carpenter's passing observation about marks on wood that no one was supposed to see. None of these things prove anything on their own, but they share a quality. They were not meant to be found. They survived by accident, by a granddaughter who kept a notebook, by a photographer who caught the edge of a frame, by a city clerk who filed a work order instead of throwing it away. The men who moved the bell did not talk much about what they experienced, but some of them wrote things down, and those small, quiet records have a way of sitting with you. The way August Frey's hand stayed warm, the way the stranger watched the camera instead of the bell, the way someone marked 4 names in pencil and never signed their own. Stories travel the same way rivers do. They find the lowest ground. They move around obstacles. They carry things with them, small pieces of the places they passed through. And by the time they reach you, they have changed shape. But they are still moving. They are still carrying something real. The rumors about the Liberty Bell did not stay in Philadelphia. They could not. Philadelphia was a city of arrivals and departures. Ships came in. Wagons went out. Families packed their lives into wooden crates and headed west toward land that had no names yet on any map. And they brought their their stories with them the way they brought their grandmother's iron pot and their father's Bible, carefully, without thinking too hard about why. By the early 1800s, the story had already split into branches. One branch said the bell cracked because it was rung too hard on purpose, not by accident, not by careless hands, by men who knew exactly what they were doing and why. This version of the story traveled with families from Pennsylvania into Ohio, into Indiana, into the flat, wide country where the sky sits low and close. Farmers told it to their sons while they worked. The sons told it to their own children years later, sitting around fires that smelled of hickory smoke and dried corn. Another branch said the crack was a signal, not a mistake, a mark, something placed there so that anyone who knew how to look would understand what it meant. This version was quieter. It did not travel as fast. It moved in letters between cousins, in whispered conversations at church socials, in the kind of talk that stops when a stranger walks into the room. Both branches agreed on one thing. The bell was not what it appeared to be. There is a particular quality to stories that survive in families for generations. They get worn smooth in certain places, like river stones. The sharp edges go first. The complicated parts get simplified. What remains is the emotional core, the feeling of the thing, and the feeling that survived in these stories was this. Something happened in Philadelphia that the official record did not fully explain. And the men who knew the most about it never said so plainly. A woman named Clara Howell, writing to her daughter from a farmhouse in western Kentucky in 1887, mentioned the bell almost in passing. She wrote that her grandfather, who had been a young man in Philadelphia in the 1840s, always said the bell's crack was no accident of metal. She did not explain further. She moved on to talk about the weather and a neighbor's sick horse. But she wrote it down. She thought it was worth including. That alone tells you something. These small mentions are scattered across old letters and family journals like seeds that never quite found soil. A line here, a half sentence there. A grandmother who always changed the subject when someone pressed her for details. A great uncle who kept a pamphlet folded inside his coat for years and never showed it to anyone. The story changed as it moved west. Some families added details that were not in the original. A secret room beneath the state house. A second bell that no one ever displayed. A list of names sealed inside the metal itself before it was poured. These additions grew like vines over an old wall. You cannot always tell where the wall ends and the vine begins, but the core stayed the same. The crack was intentional. The men who caused it belonged to something older than the country itself. And the bell was not just a bell. It was a marker. A message cast in bronze and hung in a tower where everyone could see it, but almost no one could read it. By the time the bell became a national symbol in the mid-1800s, the family stories had been circulating for decades. Most people who heard them smiled politely and moved on. The bell was a symbol of freedom. It was on posters and pamphlets. It was being printed on everything. There was no room in that story for secret societies and coded inscriptions and men who marked 4 names in pencil. But the family stories did not disappear. They just went quieter. They moved to the edges of holiday tables, to the end of long evenings when the fire had burned low and the children were almost asleep, to the kind of conversation that happens when people feel safe enough to say what they actually think. And what they thought, generation after generation, was simple. Something about that bell was never fully explained, and the people who could have explained it chose not to. That silence passed down just as surely as the story itself. Quiet, steady, still moving west. There was a man named Elias Cord. That is what the old accounts call him. A keeper, not a famous man, not a politician or a mason or a merchant with his name on a building. Just a man who was paid to watch over the bell in the years after it stopped being rung. He swept the floor around it. He kept strangers from touching it. He answered questions from visitors who came to see the famous crack. And somewhere in those quiet years, he started writing things down. The journal surfaced in Philadelphia in the late 1800s. A small book, brown leather cover, worn soft at the corners. The pages inside were close writ in a careful hand. The ink faded to the color of weak tea. It passed through several private collections before anyone thought to look at it closely. When they did, they found something unexpected. Cord was not writing about the bell's history. He was not recording dates or official visits or the names of dignitaries who came to stand near it. He was writing about the people who came in quietly, alone, and stood in front of the bell for a long time without saying anything. He wrote about what they did and what some of them left behind. Small things, a folded piece of paper tucked under the bell's edge, a coin placed flat on the floor directly beneath the crack, a sprig of dried herb, something gray-green and faintly sweet-smelling, laid against the base like an offering. Cord collected these things. He described them in careful detail. He did not seem frightened by them. He seemed, if anything, curious and a little moved. He wrote about one woman who came 3 times in a single month. She wore plain clothes. She carried nothing visible. Each time she came, she stood in front of the bell for several minutes, lips moving slightly, as if she were reading something or reciting something she had memorized long ago. On her 3rd visit, Cord finally spoke to her. He asked gently what she was doing. She told him her grandfather had worked near the state house when she was a child. He had told her the bell was a kind of clock, not for hours, she said, for something else, something longer. She did not know exactly what he had meant, but she came back because standing near, it made her feel like time was moving the right way, like things were in their proper order. She smiled at Cord and left. He wrote about her for 2 full pages. That is the thing about Cord's journal. It is not a document of conspiracy. It is a document of feeling. Page after page of ordinary people doing quiet, private things near a piece of cast bronze in a public room. People who had heard something from someone older. People who carried a half-remembered idea that this object meant more than the plaques said it did. People who came not to see history, but to be near something they could not fully name. Cord himself never claimed to know the truth of the bell's origins. He was careful about that. He wrote that he had heard the theories, the Masons, the coded inscription, the men who cracked it on purpose. He wrote that he did not know if any of it was true. But he wrote something else too. He wrote that it did not matter as much as people thought it did. What mattered, he said, was that people kept coming, that they kept feeling something, that the bell had become a place where people brought their private sense that the world held more than it showed. He called it a threshold, a word he used carefully only once. A place where the seen world and the unseen world sat close together, where you could stand in an ordinary room and feel the weight of something very old pressing gently against the present moment. The journal is not widely cited. It does not appear in most official histories of the bell. A few researchers have mentioned it in footnotes. A few collectors have passed it along, but it survives. Somewhere, that small brown book still holds Cord's careful handwriting, still holds the names he gave to the quiet visitors, still holds his description of the dried herb and the folded papers, and the coins placed just so on the cold stone floor. He watched over the bell for 11 years. When he stopped, he left the journal behind. No note explaining why. No instructions for who should read it. Just the book left in the room near the bell, like everything else people had been leaving there for decades. A small thing, carefully made, meant to last. Now step back from the journal. Step back from the keeper and his careful words. Step back from everything that has been said and written and argued over. Come stand here instead. Come stand in the dark. It is night in Philadelphia. A real night, not a painted one. The kind of night that has weight to it. The kind that settles on your shoulders like a wool coat pulled from a cold closet. The sky above the old city is deep and wide. Stars press through the dark in clusters, faint and patient, the way they have always been. The streets below are quiet. The cobblestones are slick with the cold breath of the river, and they catch the moonlight in small silver pools between the stones. You are standing near the building where the bell has rested for a long time now. The air smells like damp brick and old wood and something faintly mineral, the way cities smell when the noise dies down and the stone begins to breathe again. A dog barks somewhere 2 streets over and then goes quiet. A door closes, then nothing. This is the city at its most honest. Here is something most people do not think about. The Liberty Bell was not the only bell in Philadelphia. Not even close. The city had bells the way it had rivers and taverns and narrow, winding streets. Bells in church towers, bells on market stalls, bells on ships tied along the docks where the Delaware ran dark and wide. The sound of bells was the sound of the city itself. It was how people knew the time, how they knew when to gather and when to go home. The bells were the city's voice. 3 bells in particular mattered in the years when the Pennsylvania State House bell was still new. 3 bells that rang over the same streets, the same rooftops, the same people going about their daily lives. The State House bell was the largest, the heaviest, the one with the inscription pressed into its shoulder like a brand. But the other 2 had their own voices, their own histories, their own keepers who polished them and watched over them and knew their particular sound the way a shepherd knows each animal in a flock. Stand here in the dark and try to imagine all 3 ringing at once. The sound would have been enormous. It would have rolled down the streets and out over the river and into the flat farmland beyond the city's edge. It would have reached people who had never seen the bells themselves. People who only knew them as sound, as signal, as the voice of something larger than themselves, calling out across the distance. And yet, only one of those 3 bells became famous. Only one became a symbol. Only one cracked and was kept and carried across the country on a flatbed car and placed behind glass and visited by millions of people who stand before it and feel something they cannot quite name. The other 2 are mostly forgotten now. Their names appear in old records, a line here, a line there, a mention in a letter, a note in a ledger. They rang the same air. They hung in the same city. They called out over the same cobblestones you are standing on right now. But history chose one and let the others go. That is how it works sometimes. One thing rises. The rest fall back into the quiet. There is no good explanation for why the cracked bell became the chosen one. Some people say it was the crack itself, that the flaw made it human, that a perfect bell is just a tool, but a broken bell is a story. Others say it was the inscription, that those words from Leviticus landed at exactly the right moment in history, when a young country needed something ancient to lean against. Others say it was the Freemasons and their careful hands and their long plans and their patience that stretched across decades. Maybe all of those things are true at once. Stand here a little longer. The night is not going anywhere. The cold comes up through the soles of your shoes, and the stars move their slow arc overhead, and the city breathes around you in the dark. Somewhere inside that building, the bell is resting. It has been resting for a long time. It does not ring anymore. It is too fragile now, too old, too full of its own history to take the impact of a clapper. But the silence it holds is not empty. It is the silence of something that has already said what it came to say. Something that rang out once, long ago, over these same dark streets, and has been waiting ever since to see if anyone was listening. Philadelphia kept the story. That is what cities do with their mysteries. They fold them into the stone and the brick and the daily habit of living until the mystery becomes part of the air itself. You breathe it in without knowing. You walk past the place where something strange happened, and you feel something, a small pull, a quiet weight, and you do not know why. The bell changed this city in ways that no museum placard will tell you. It started small. In the years after the crack became permanent, after the bell fell silent for good, people began to treat it differently. Not like a broken thing, like a sacred one. There is a difference. A broken thing gets repaired or thrown away. A sacred thing gets tended. It gets watched over. It gets visited by strangers who travel a long way just to stand in front of it and feel whatever it is they came to feel. Philadelphia learned to be a city of tenders. The neighborhoods around Independence Hall developed a particular quality over the generations. A quietness, a sense that the past was not past, that it was still present and still watching. Old families in those neighborhoods passed down certain habits. You did not shout near the hall. You did not run. You walked slowly, and you looked up at the buildings, and you remembered that people had stood in those same spots and made decisions that changed everything. The bell was part of that feeling. It was the anchor of it. Certain trades grew up around the mystery too. Engravers and metalworkers in Philadelphia carried a quiet pride in their craft that traced back to the bell's story. The idea that metal holds memory, that what you pour into a mold and what words you cast into the surface matter more than people think. Apprentices in those shops heard the old stories. They heard about the Foundry men in London who got it wrong the first time. They heard about the men in Philadelphia who recast it and got it wrong again. They heard that some errors cannot be fixed, only accepted, and that acceptance sometimes turns an error into something greater than the original plan ever was. That lesson spread far beyond the metalworking shops. It became a kind of local philosophy, a way of thinking about failure that is particular to this city. Philadelphia has always had a complicated relationship with perfection. It was the first capital, and then it was not. It was the center of everything, and then the center moved. It cracked like the bell, and it kept going. The people here will tell you, if you ask them the right way, that there is something in the crack itself, something that would not exist in a perfect surface, a character, a proof that the thing was real and used and alive. The Freemason lodges of Philadelphia never made public statements about the bell. They did not need to. Their silence on the subject became its own kind of statement. When researchers and curious visitors came asking questions, the lodges were polite and unhelpful in equal measure. They smiled and offered coffee and said they did not know what the visitors were talking about. And then they changed the subject with the smooth ease of people who have had a great deal of practice changing subjects. That silence fed the story. It always does. By the time the bell was moved to its current glass pavilion, the mythology around it had grown into something enormous and quiet, like an old tree whose roots run under the whole street. Tourists came for the history they learned in school. But some of them, a smaller group, came for the other thing. They came because they had read something, or heard something, or dreamed something that made them feel the official story was only the surface. They came to look at the crack and think their own thoughts about it. The city welcomed all of them equally. That is another thing Philadelphia learned from the bell. That a symbol can hold more than one meaning at a time. That the same object can be a civic treasure and a secret signal and a broken tool and a work of art all at once. You do not have to choose which one is true. You can hold all of them together, the way the bell holds its silence, the way the crack holds its shape, the way the city holds its long and complicated memory. The Smithsonian has bells. It has artifacts and documents and cases full of carefully labeled history. What it does not have is this particular weight, this particular feeling of standing in front of something that knows more than it is telling. That belongs to Philadelphia. It has always belonged to Philadelphia, and the city keeps it close, the way you keep a secret that is also somehow a gift. There is a woman named Clara Bowen who left Philadelphia in 1887. She was 23 years old. She packed 2 dresses, a Bible, and a small notebook into a leather bag, and boarded a train heading west. She was going to Kansas, where her husband had already gone ahead to work a piece of flat brown land near a town called Salina. She had never wanted to leave, but that is how it went for a lot of people in those years. The city pushed you out, and the land pulled you in. And somewhere between the two, you lost the place you came from. Before she left, Clara did one thing she had not planned to do. She walked to Independence Hall. She stood in front of the bell. This was before the bell had its own building, before it had guards and velvet ropes, and a line of tourists stretching down the block. Back then, you could get close. You could stand near enough to feel the cold that came off the metal on a winter morning. And Clara stood there for a long time, looking at the crack. She wrote about it in her notebook. The notebook survived. A great-granddaughter found it in a cedar chest in Topeka in the 1970s, and eventually donated it to a small historical society in eastern Kansas. The pages are brown at the edges now, soft as old cloth, but the words are still clear. Clara wrote that the crack looked like a river seen from a great height. She wrote that it did not look like damage. It looked like something that had always been there, like a line drawn by a careful hand. She wrote that she pressed her fingers near it, not touching, just close, and that the metal felt like it was breathing. She knew that was not possible. She wrote it anyway. She carried that image with her to Kansas. The flat land out there has its own kind of silence, wide and pale and full of wind. Clara wrote that some When the wind came across the fields at night, she heard something low and round in it. Not a bell exactly, more like the memory of a bell, more like the feeling a sound leaves behind after the sound itself is gone. She told her children about the bell. She told them about the crack and what it looked like up close. She told them the things she had heard growing up in Philadelphia, the whispers about the men who ordered it, the symbols cast into the bronze, the night someone rang it too hard, and the metal gave way in a line as clean and deliberate as a signature. Her children grew up in Kansas and had never seen the bell, but they knew it. They knew it the way you know a place from a story, which is sometimes more deeply than you know a place you have actually been. Her granddaughter, a woman named Ruth, drove to Philadelphia in 1951. She was in her 40s by then, a school teacher from Wichita with gray at her temples and a habit of writing things down in small notebooks, just like her grandmother. Ruth stood in front of the bell for a long time. She had brought Clara's notebook with her. She read the old description and then looked at the crack and then read the description again. She said later that it was exactly right. The crack did look like a river from a great height. It did look like something drawn rather than broken. It ran up the side of the bell in a line that was almost graceful, almost intentional. The way a fault line runs through stone, following some deep logic that the surface does not explain. Ruth wrote her own notes. She wrote that standing there felt like completing a circle, that her grandmother had looked at this same crack and carried it west, and now she had carried it back, that the bell had waited the way old things wait, patient and heavy and full of whatever you bring to them. The crack is about 2 feet long. It is wider at the bottom than at the top. The edges are smooth now, worn by time and air, and the hands of people who have reached toward it for 2.5 centuries. The bronze around it is dark green in some places and pale gold in others, the colors shifting depending on the light. Up close, the crack does not look like a flaw. It looks like a feature. It looks like the bell was always going to have it, the way a face is always going to have the lines that come with age. It looks like something that belongs there. Clara Bowen knew that in 1887. Ruth knew it in 1951. people who stand in front of it today, pressing close, tilting their heads, looking at the line in the metal. Most of them know it too. Every day, people leave things at the base of the Liberty Bell. Not in a formal way. Not in a way anyone planned or organized. It just happens. It has been happening for longer than anyone can trace. Small things mostly. A folded piece of paper. A coin pressed flat by a train wheel. A dried flower, its petals gone brown at the edges. A child's drawing, rolled up tight and tucked against the base like someone was posting a letter. The rangers who watch over the bell find these things in the mornings. They collect them quietly. They do not make announcements. There is no official policy about it. Or if there is, nobody talks about it much. The objects simply appear, and then they are gone, and then new ones take their place. Nobody told people to do this. There is no sign that says to leave something. There is no tradition written down in any guidebook. And yet, generation after generation, people feel the pull. They reach into a pocket. They set something down. They step back, and something in them feels finished, the way a long breath feels finished when it finally lets go. You have to wonder what they are leaving these things for. Some of them are leaving prayers. You can tell by the way they stand, heads bowed, lips moving just slightly, hands folded in front of them like they are standing in a church. The bell is not a religious object, at least not officially. But something about it pulls that posture out of people. Something about it makes them go quiet and inward the way sacred spaces do. Some of them are leaving grief. A woman in a gray coat stood at the bell for nearly 20 minutes one cold Tuesday morning in November. She had a photograph in her hand. She looked at the bell, and she looked at the photograph, and she set the photograph down at the base, face up, so whoever was in it could see the crack too. She did not cry. She just nodded, the way you nod when something is understood between you and another person without needing words. Some of them are leaving questions. That is the part that stays with you. The people who come with something unresolved. A young man who stood there for a long time with his hands in his pockets, just looking. A pair of sisters who argued in low voices about something. Then both went quiet when they got close to the bell, as if it had asked them to stop. An old man who touched the crack with 2 fingers, very gently, and then stood still for a moment with his eyes closed, like he was listening. What are they listening for? The bell has not rung in almost 200 years. The last time it made a sound was 1846, and even then the sound was wrong. A dull, broken tone that told everyone in the room that something was finished. The crack had won. The bell had gone silent, and it has stayed silent ever since, sitting in its glass pavilion on Market Street, surrounded by people who have traveled from every corner of the country and every corner of the world to stand in front of it. A silent bell is a strange thing to travel to see, and yet they come, millions of them. They come and they stand and they look at the crack, and something happens to them. Something shifts. You can see it in their faces if you watch. They arrive with the busy, distracted look that people carry through airports and parking lots and tourist lines. And then they get close to the bell, and the look changes. Something behind the eyes goes still. Maybe it is just the weight of old things. Maybe being near something that has lasted 2.5 centuries does something to a person, reminds them of how brief they are, how small, how temporary. Maybe that is enough to make them quiet. Or maybe the people who left things in basements in 1750 knew something. Maybe the men who cast symbols into the metal knew something. Maybe Clara Bowen knew something in 1887, and Ruth knew something in 1951. And the woman with the photograph knew something on that cold Tuesday morning in November. Maybe the bell is not silent at all. Maybe it has been speaking this whole time in a language that does not use sound, in the language of the crack, in the language of the things left at its feet, in the language of the stillness that falls over people when they finally get close enough to look. The bell is still there. The crack is still there. And people are still leaving things. And so here we are. The story has come all the way around, like a river finding the sea. You started somewhere back at the beginning, in the cold morning air of colonial Philadelphia, with a bell that had not yet cracked, with men who had not yet decided what to do with it. And now you are here. The fire is low. The room is warm and quiet. The night has settled in around you like a heavy coat. The bell is still in Philadelphia. It sits in a glass pavilion on Independence Mall, lit from below by soft amber light. The crack runs up its side like a line drawn by a careful hand. Tourists come and go all day. They take their pictures. They buy their keychains. They step back out into the sun and keep moving. But for a moment, each one of them stood in front of something that has been in this world since 1752. Something that has outlasted every person who ever touched it. That is a strange thing to sit with. The men who ordered it are gone. The men who cast it are gone. The men who cracked it and recast it and cracked it again, all gone. The men who met in basement rooms by candlelight, who pressed their fingers to symbols in the metal, who believed they were building something that would last forever, all of them gone. And yet, the bell is still here, still cracked in the same place, still carrying whatever it was they put into it. There is a kind of comfort in that, not the comfort of answers, the comfort of knowing that some things hold. You do not have to believe the whole story to feel that. You do not have to believe in secret societies or hidden symbols, or the old woman who heard it ring on a night when no one was there. You can hold the mystery loosely, the way you hold a stone from a river, smooth and cool in your palm, not knowing which current carried it, or how many years it traveled to reach your hand. The people who keep this story alive are not scholars. They are not historians with offices and grants. They are people like Clara Bowen, who wrote things down because they felt important. People like Ruth, who stood in front of the bell in 1951 and felt something shift inside her chest. People like the woman with the photograph, standing in the cold on a Tuesday morning, holding something she could not explain. Ordinary people who paid attention. Ordinary people who decided the story was worth keeping. That is how all of these stories survive. Not in books, not in museums, in the telling. One person to another, across a table, across a fire, across the quiet dark of a late night when the world has gone soft and still, and the mind is open to things it usually keeps the door closed against. The bell does not need you to believe in it. It has been there for 2.5 centuries. It will be there long after you and I are gone. But there is something to the idea that it is still speaking, presence, in the way it makes people go quiet when they finally stand in front of it, in the way it draws people back year after year to leave small things at its feet like offerings to something they cannot name. Maybe that is the whole mystery right there. Not the crack, not the symbols, not the men in the basements. Maybe the mystery is that we keep coming back, that something in us recognizes something in it, that across 270 years, the bell and the people still find each other. Outside, somewhere, the night is very deep. The stars are out over Philadelphia, the same stars that hung over the men who cast that bell, the same stars that watched the crack form and spread and settle into its final shape. The glass pavilion is dark and quiet. The amber light is low. The bell stands in the stillness, the way it has stood through every night since they first hung it. The crack is there. The inscription is there. And somewhere in the space between the two, the story goes on. It always goes on. Subscribe for a brand new mystery every night. One tap and a new story is waiting for you tomorrow. Sleep well.